The third time she appeared, a silent gray ghost in the dead hours of the night shift, Dr. Ben Evans was almost too exhausted to be surprised. It was 3:17 a.m., according to the cheap plastic clock on the nurse's station wall. The kind of hour where the world outside the hospital windows wasn't just dark, it felt empty, hollowed out. The fluorescent lights hummed a low, tired song, bleaching all the color out of everything, making the scuff marks on the linoleum floor look like old scars. The air smelled like antiseptic and loneliness, and the faint, sweet undertone of the apple cinnamon tea he'd been drinking just to feel something warm in his hands. His whole body ached with a deep, bone-level weariness that had nothing to do with the 2 emergency appendectomies he'd just handled back to back. This was a different kind of tired. The kind that settles in after too many long nights, too many hushed conversations in hallways, too many faces you can't quite fix. And then, there she was. Just a flicker of movement at the very edge of the automatic doors. They'd hissed open for a gurney an hour ago, and hadn't quite sealed shut since, leaving a 2-inch gap to the outside world. A sliver of the cold, damp night. Her head appeared first, low to the ground. 2 eyes. Not like emeralds or jewels, nothing that poetic. They were the color of old moss on a river stone, watchful, impossibly ancient. She slipped through the gap without a sound, a wisp of smoke given feline form. Her fur was the dull, dusty gray of concrete after a rain, and along her left flank, a patch of it was missing. An old battle wound from a life lived entirely on her own terms. She was thin, but not starving, wary, but not feral. She moved with a deliberate, quiet purpose, like she had a job to do, and the rest of the world was just background noise. Ben froze, his styrofoam cup halfway to his lips. He didn't move a muscle. He'd heard the rumors, of course. The night nurses talked about her sometimes in hushed, amused tones. The hospital ghost, they called her. The little gray visitor. But he'd always written it off as stress-induced folklore, a shared hallucination born of caffeine deprivation and sleep debt. Yet, here she was. Undeniable. She didn't look at him. She didn't beg for food or scratch at the doors. She simply sat on the cool, clean floor, just inside the threshold of the ER, tucked her paws neatly beneath her, and waited. Her gaze was fixed down the long, dim hallway that led to the older wing of the hospital, the part that wasn't for emergencies, the part where people stayed for a long, long time. Ben let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He slowly lowered his cup. The cat's ear twitched, a tiny, precise movement at the sound. But she didn't turn. She just kept her vigil. He found himself studying her, this tiny creature who had walked into a place of sickness and stainless steel as if she owned it. He noticed the way her ribs showed just a little too clearly through her fur, the way one of her ears was slightly notched at the tip, the quiet, steady rise and fall of her sides. She was completely at ease in this sterile, unnatural environment. It was the most peaceful thing he'd seen all night. A memory, sharp and unbidden, surfaced through his fatigue. His wife, Sarah, in their garden 2 summers ago, laughing as a neighbor's tabby cat wound its way through her tomato plants. "They just know, Ben," she'd said, her smile easy and bright. "They always find the people who need a little quiet company." He pushed the memory down, a familiar, dull ache blooming behind his sternum. That was a different life. A life with sunlight in it. He'd been working these relentless night shifts for 6 months now. It wasn't just the schedule, he'd volunteered for it. The days were too loud, too full of couples holding hands in the park, too full of families, too full of a future he'd once mapped out with such certainty. The nights were quieter. The pain was easier to carry when everyone else was asleep, when the world wasn't constantly reminding you of what you'd lost. He felt hollowed out, a doctor going through the motions, fixing other people while he himself felt permanently, irreparably broken. The cat suddenly stood up. Her movement was so fluid it was like watching water change shape. She turned her head, and for the first time, those old moss eyes looked directly at him. Not through him. At him. It was an unnervingly intelligent gaze. It felt like she was looking past the blue scrubs, past the stethoscope around his neck, past the tired face of a 34-year-old man. It felt like she was seeing the raw, aching thing he carried inside. She held his gaze for 3 full seconds. A lifetime, in the middle of the night. In that silence, he felt a strange, impossible question form in his mind. Did you send her? Then, she turned away. She took a few silent steps down the hallway, her tail a quiet question mark in the air. She paused at the first door on the left. Room 104. It was a private room, and long-term patient. An old man named Arthur, who'd had a stroke, whose family visited less and less as the weeks wore on. The cat didn't go in. She just sat down. Again, right outside the door, her body a small, still sentry against the gleaming white floor. And then she began to purr. It wasn't a loud, rumbling motor of a purr. It was something softer, deeper. A vibration you felt more than you heard, a low, resonant hum that seemed to travel through the floor and up through the soles of Ben's shoes. It was a sound completely at odds with the steady electronic beeping of the heart monitor inside the room. It was alive. It was organic. It was the first real, unmedicated, unsanitized thing he'd heard all night. Ben stood there, in the humming silence of the nurse's station. A doctor who had seen everything, utterly captivated by a stray cat purring outside a patient's door. He didn't understand it. He didn't need to. In that moment, the heavy weight in his chest felt just a fraction lighter. The endless, draining night felt just a little bit shorter. He had the distinct, overwhelming feeling that this wasn't a random visit. This was the beginning of something. He didn't know what. He didn't know why. But as he watched the small gray cat keep her silent, purring watch, he knew, with a certainty that went straight to his bones, that her secret, whatever it was, would change everything. You're here, listening. And that means more than you know. If you feel safe in these stories, your one subscribe helps me keep this quiet little corner alive. Thank you for being part of this peaceful world. The next night, Ben found himself listening for the hiss of the doors. It was a ridiculous thing, really. He was a surgeon. His hands were trained to listen to the subtle, silent language of the human body, to feel the delicate structures beneath skin and muscle. They weren't meant to be preoccupied with the possible entrance of a stray cat. Yet, as the clock ticked past 2 a.m., his focus kept drifting from the patient charts on his screen to that 2-inch gap leading to the outside world. The air in the ER was still, holding its breath. The only sounds were the distant, rhythmic beep of a monitor from a recovery room and the low, intermittent tapping of the charge nurse, Maria, entering data at her terminal. The smell of stale coffee and industrial cleaner hung in the air, a permanent fixture of the place. He'd mentioned the cat to Maria earlier, his tone casual, offhand. So, I saw the famous hospital ghost last night. She hadn't even looked up from her computer. Oh, Dusty? Yeah, she's a regular. Comes in most nights around this time. Doesn't bother anybody. We used to try and shoo her out, but she'd just look at you like you were the one being rude. Eventually, we just figured, what's the harm? Dusty. The name fit her. That dry, concrete gray coat. The way she seemed to materialize out of nothing, like a pile of leaves stirred by the wind. Does she always go to room 104? Ben asked, trying to sound clinically curious, not personally invested. That made Maria pause. She swiveled in her chair, her kind, tired face softening. Mr. Henley's room? Yeah, pretty much. Sits right there outside his door. Purrs like a little engine. Funny, isn't it? His family's hardly ever here, but that scruffy little cat hasn't missed a night in weeks. She gave a slight, sad shake of her head. He's not doing so well, you know. Fading. It's mostly palliative care now. Just making him comfortable. Watch the words landed heavily in Ben's gut. Fading. Palliative care. He knew what that meant. It was the long, slow goodbye. It was the reason he usually avoided this wing. It held a mirror up to a kind of loss he wasn't ready to examine. He just nodded and went back to his charts. But the image of the cat, Dusty, sitting sentry for a dying man she'd never met, lodged itself in his mind and wouldn't let go. And then, at 3:08 a.m., she came back. It was the same silent slip through the doors, the same deliberate, unhurried pace. She carried the scent of the night with her this time, a cool, clean smell of damp asphalt and distant rain. She paused for a moment, giving the hallway a slow, sweeping glance with those ancient eyes. She saw Maria, who gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod of recognition. She saw an orderly wheeling a linen cart down the hall, ignoring her completely. Then her gaze landed on Ben. There was no startlement this time. No frozen surprise. It was more like an acknowledgement. "You're still here too" glance. She held his eyes for just a beat before turning and padding down the hall toward room 104. She took her usual spot, tucking her paws, and began her quiet vigil. The low, resonant purr started up again, a soft vibration in the sterile silence. This time, Ben didn't just watch. He found himself getting up, moving slowly, as if approaching a skittish bird. He stopped a good 10 feet away, leaning against the wall opposite Mr. Henley's door. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, a silent companion to this strange nightly ritual. Dusty watched him for a moment, her purr stuttering slightly, then resuming, a little louder, as if accepting his presence. She didn't approach him. She didn't flee. She just allowed him to be there, to witness. This became the new pattern. For the next several nights, Ben's shift took on a new, secret rhythm. The frantic, high adrenaline pace of the ER would eventually settle into the deep night lull, and he would wait. He'd finish his rounds, complete his paperwork, and then, almost without thinking, he'd find himself drifting toward the hallway of the old wing. Some nights, Dusty was already there, settled in her spot. Other nights, he'd arrive first, and feel a small, inexplicable ping of worry until she silently appeared. He started bringing things, not a bowl of milk or scraps of food. Something in her demeanor made it clear she wasn't asking for that. She wasn't a beggar. She was a professional, a night shift worker just like him. Instead, he brought a quiet companionship. He'd lean against the same spot on the wall, sipping his tea, and just be. He started talking to her. His voice a low murmur, not much louder than her purring. "Rough night in there," he'd say, nodding toward the ER. "Car accident, teenage kid. He's gonna make it, but it's hard. It's always hard." Dusty would slow blink at him, a long, deliberate closing and opening of her moss-green eyes. It was a cat's kiss, a sign of trust. It felt like an absolution. "What's your story, huh?" he whispered one night, the words feeling dangerously close to the ache in his own chest. "Who are you waiting for?" She, of course, didn't answer. She just purred, her gaze fixed on the door to room 104, as if she could see straight through it. As if her purr was a medicine she was diligently administering. Ben began to notice the small things, the tiny, believable behaviors that made her real. The way one of her whiskers was bent slightly askew. The way she'd sometimes twitch the very tip of her tail, just once, as if swatting away a fly of a thought. The way she'd lick a paw and drag it over her ear in a quick, efficient grooming motion before resuming her stillness, as if remembering she was on duty. He saw the faint, silvery scars on her nose, the map of a difficult life written on her skin. He found himself looking forward to it. This strange, silent companionship in the witching hour. The hospital was a place of intense, often painful, human connection. Patients clung to your hand, families wept on your shoulder, lives literally hung in the balance of your decisions. It was loud, even in its silence. But this was quiet. This was simple. There were no demands, no expectations. Just a man, a cat, and a closed door. Have you ever had an animal wait for you, even when you didn't ask them to? Not because they want food or a door opened, but just because? It's a humbling thing. It chips away at the armor you didn't even know you were wearing. For Ben, whose armor had become a second skin, whose entire being was braced against the next wave of pain, these quiet nights were like a drip of water on a stone. Slowly, imperceptibly, wearing him down, making him soft again. One night, about a week into their routine, he arrived to find her spot empty. A cold knot of disappointment tightened in his stomach. He checked the clock. 3:22 a.m. She was late. He stood against his wall, his tea going cold in his hand. his ears straining for the sound of the automatic doors. Nothing. The hallway felt emptier, longer, colder. He realized with a jolt that he'd been relying on her. This scruffy, independent creature had become a fixed point in his unstable universe. Her absence felt like a personal rejection, a silly but potent reminder that good things have a habit of disappearing. He was about to give up, to head back to the glaring lights of the nurse's station, when he heard it. A tiny, almost inaudible sound, not from the direction of the doors, from inside Mr. Henley's room. It was a soft thud, then a faint, scraping sound. Ben's medical training snapped into place, a patient in distress. He pushed off from the wall and moved quickly to the door, his heart starting to thump a little faster. He pushed it open gently, ready for anything. The room was dim, lit only by the soft glow of the bathroom nightlight. Mr. Henley was asleep in his bed, his breathing shallow but even, his face pale and peaceful against the pillow. And there, on the floor beside the bed, was Dusty. She must have slipped in when a nurse had come to check his vitals. She wasn't on the bed. She wasn't even touching him. She was sitting upright, her body perfectly still, her head bowed low, and she was pulling something. With her teeth, she was ever so gently tugging an old, worn-looking wool blanket that had been draped over the foot of the bed. It was a patient, careful motion. She wasn't trying to steal it. She was tugging it downward, inch by meticulous inch, toward the floor. The thud he'd heard must have been her pulling a weighted corner off the mattress. Ben stood frozen in the doorway, utterly bewildered. What was she doing? Dusty gave one more firm tug, and a corner of the blanket puddled softly onto the linoleum. She immediately let go of the fabric, circled the small woolen patch twice, and then settled down onto it, curling into a tight, neat circle right there on the floor, right beside Mr. Henley's bed. She let out a deep, satisfied sigh, and the purr started up again, louder now in the quiet room. A sound that seemed to fill the space with a palpable warmth. She had made herself a bed. Not on the expensive, sanitized hospital linens. Not on a chair. She had pulled a piece of his blanket, a piece of him, down to her level, and made her nest there. She closed her eyes, her purr a steady, rhythmic counterpoint to the weak beep of the heart monitor. She wasn't just visiting. She was staying. Ben felt a lump form in his throat, so sudden and so large it was painful. He must have made a sound, a sharp intake of breath, because Dusty's eyes opened. She looked at him standing in the doorway. There was no alarm in her gaze, no guilt. She just looked at him, her purr never faltering, and then she did something she had never done before. Slowly, deliberately, she stretched one front paw out toward him. It wasn't a reach. It was a gesture, an offering. Her tiny pink pads were visible for a moment before she retracted her paw and tucked it back under her chest. She gave him one more slow, sleepy blink, a look that seemed to say, "It's okay. You can come in." And in that moment, in the dim light of a dying man's room, witnessed only by a stray cat, the first crack appeared in the wall around Ben's heart. It was just a hairline fracture, a tiny split in the dam. But it was enough. He leaned his head against the doorframe, closed his eyes, and just listened to her purr. He didn't understand it. He didn't need to. The bond was sealed. She had finally, truly, let him in. The world outside the hospital windows turned cold, a sharp, brittle cold that made the metal doorframes ache to the touch and turned your breath into small, ghostly clouds in the air between shifts. Winter was settling in, and with it a change came over Dusty. It was subtle at first. Ben almost missed it. He'd grown so accustomed to their nightly routine, to the quiet comfort of her presence, that he'd started to take it for granted. He'd arrive at his spot against the wall, she'd be there on her corner of the blanket, and they'd share the silence. But then, he began to notice the small disruptions in the pattern. She was more restless. Her purring, once a constant, steady hum, became intermittent. She'd be there one moment, a soft, gray comma on the floor, and the next, her head would jerk up, her ears swiveling toward the hallway as if she'd heard a frequency no human could detect. She'd stand up, stretch her back into a high, tense arch, and pace a few steps toward the door before stopping, seeming to war with herself, and then returning to her spot with a quiet, frustrated sigh. Her focus was divided. Her vigil was now a struggle. Ben watched her one night, a new kind of worry knitting his brow. "What is it, girl?" he murmured, his voice low. "What's out there?" She didn't slow blink at him. She just stared toward the doors, her entire body taut with a tension he could feel from across the room. Her purr had completely stopped. Then, without warning, she'd vanish. It wasn't like her usual departures at dawn, which were gradual, a slow stretching and sauntering toward the exit as the shift change brought noise and light. These were abrupt, urgent disappearances. He'd look down at his pager for a second, look up, and she'd be gone. The corner of the blanket would be empty. The air where her purr had been would feel suddenly hollow and cold. She'd be gone. For hours, sometimes for the rest of the night. He'd leave his post, a hollow feeling of his own growing in his chest, and return to the ER's bright lights, feeling oddly abandoned. The next night she'd return, but she'd look different. Worn was the word that came to Ben's mind. Her normally sleek, if scruffy fur would be matted in places, with a tiny burr caught near her shoulder or a leaf fragment tangled in. Her tail. She'd have a faint, earthy smell clinging to her, of damp soil and decaying leaves, the scent of the overgrown, vacant lot that bordered the hospital's parking garage. Her eyes, usually so clear and watchful, would be heavy-lidded, with a deep, profound fatigue. She'd collapse onto her blanket corner instead of gracefully settling, and her purr, when it came, would sound ragged, thin, like a motor struggling to turn over. She was exhausted. She was running herself into the ground. Ben's medical mind began to race through possibilities. Was she sick? Did she have a parasite? Was it the cold? He started bringing a small tin of high-quality tuna, the kind in spring water, and placing it near her. She'd eat it, gratefully, and with a voracious hunger he'd never seen in her before, but it didn't replenish her. She'd finish the last bite, lick the tin clean, and then slump back into her exhaustion, as if the energy from the food was being instantly siphoned away to some other, more demanding purpose. The mystery of it consumed him. It was all he could think about during his long, quiet hours. He found himself staring at the gap in the doors, not waiting for her to come in, but wondering where she was coming from. What was pulling her away? What was demanding so much from her? One night, he arrived to find her already gone. Her blanket corner was vacant. The disappointment was a physical ache. He'd had a particularly brutal day. A young mother with a relentless, aggressive cancer had taken a turn for the worse. He'd had to sit with her husband, a man about his own age, and talk about pain management and comfort care, all while seeing his own ghost reflected in the man's shattered eyes. He'd needed the quiet. He'd needed her quiet. He slumped against his usual wall, letting the cold of the plaster seep through his scrubs. The hallway felt profoundly lonely. He looked at Mr. Henley's door. The old man's breathing had become more irregular, more shallow. The end was drawing closer. Ben wondered if Dusty knew, if that was part of her restlessness. Do you think animals know when we're at our lowest? Not just one person, but a whole building full of quiet sorrow? He felt sure they did. He felt sure she did. He was about to push off and head back, surrendering to the night, when something on the floor caught his eye. It was a small, dark shape lying just beside the worn corner of the blanket. It wasn't a burr or a leaf. It was a feather, a small, perfectly formed gray and white striped feather, like from a sparrow or a wren. It was clean, undamaged. It looked like it had been placed there, not dropped. Ben knelt down, his knees cracking in the silence. He picked up the feather. It was delicate, light as air. He turned it over in his fingers. Why was this here? Had it gotten caught in her fur? From one of her journeys outside. The next night there was another one. Same spot, same type of feather. This one was beside a small, twisted piece of red yarn, the kind that might come from a worn-out sweater. A gift? Were they gifts? It was a ridiculous thought. Cats brought people dead mice, half-eaten birds, the grim trophies of their hunt. They didn't bring pristine feathers and bits of soft yarn. That was the behavior of something else. Something he couldn't explain. He started checking every night. The offerings were never there when she was present. They would appear only after she'd left on one of her frantic disappearances. It was as if she was depositing them on her way out. A tiny, gray and white feather. A smooth, iridescent black shell of a beetle. A single velvety pink petal from a flower that had no business blooming in December. They were small, insignificant things. Trash, really. But they didn't feel like trash. The care with which they were left, the consistency of the spot, the selection of objects that were soft, colorful, textural. It felt intentional. It felt like a message he was failing to decipher. The worry curdled into a low-grade fear. He was losing her. Whatever was happening out there in the cold, it was claiming more and more of her. She was fading before his eyes, her energy being leached away by this relentless secret. He found himself listening to the police scanners in the ER with a new, personal dread, terrified of hearing a report about a hit-and-run involving a gray cat. The fear was irrational, overwhelming. This cat, this stray, had become a tether holding him to the world of feeling, and he could feel the rope fraying. He had to know. He couldn't just stand by and watch her work herself to death for a reason he couldn't understand. The plan formed one night during a lull. It was simple, and it felt like a betrayal, even as he thought it. The next time she got that look, that distant, frantic look in her eyes, and bolted for the door, he would follow her. The opportunity came 2 nights later. It was bitterly cold, a night that promised frost. Dusty had been a bundle of nerves from the moment she arrived. She hadn't even touched the tuna he'd brought. She just paced, her tail twitching, her ears on a constant swivel. She was listening for something. She was waiting for a signal. When it came, it was nothing Ben could hear. But she froze mid-pace, her whole body orienting toward the doors like a compass needle finding north. She gave one last fleeting look toward Mr. Henley's door, a look that seemed almost apologetic. And then she was off. Not her usual slinking walk. A run. A frantic, determined sprint down the hallway. Ben didn't hesitate. He pushed off the wall and went after her. He followed the tip of her gray tail as it disappeared through the automatic doors. The cold hit him like a wall the second he stepped outside, sharp and shocking, biting through his thin scrubs. The parking lot was vast and poorly lit, pools of jaundiced light from the sodium lamps creating islands of visibility in a sea of darkness. He saw her, a darting shadow, heading not toward the streets, but around the side of the building, toward the back of the campus, toward the old abandoned ambulance bay, and the vast overgrown lot beyond it. The no man's land, the orderlies called it, full of weeds, construction debris, and forgotten memories. He broke into a run, his sneakers silent on the cold asphalt. He couldn't lose her. He couldn't. The air tasted of metal and old concrete. His heart was hammering against his ribs, not from the exertion, but from a rising primal panic. What was he going to find? Was she hurt? Was she trapped? He rounded the corner of the building, and the world fell away into deeper darkness. The single light back here was burned out. The skeletal outlines of dormant bulldozers and piles of gravel looked like monstrous shapes in the gloom. The weeds were tall here, dried and brittle with winter, rustling like skeletons in the faint wind. He stopped, panting, his breath pluming in the dark. He'd lost her. The darkness had swallowed her whole. No, 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 no. He stood there, feeling the cold seep into his bones, a profound sense of failure washing over him. He'd failed her. He was too late. And then he heard it. Faint. So faint he thought he might be imagining it. It wasn't a cry of pain. It wasn't a sound of distress. It was a purr. Her purr. But different. Softer. Lower. More rhythmic than he'd ever heard it. It was a sound he instinctively knew was not meant for him. It was a private, intimate sound. It was coming from a few yards away, from a tangle of shadows beneath the rusted-out chassis of an old abandoned ambulance that was waiting for scrap. It was a dark, sheltered space, protected from the wind and the worst of the cold. Ben took a step forward, then another, his feet crunching softly on the frozen grass. His eyes began to adjust to the deep shadows under the vehicle, and then he saw her. Dusty was curled into a tight, perfect circle. Her body was curved around something, sheltering it. Her head was bent low, and she was licking, grooming with a fierce, devoted tenderness. Her purr was a constant, rolling thunder, a sound of pure, unadulterated contentment and focus. And then he saw what she was curled around. Not a something, a someone. Small, tiny, mewling, blind. A squirming, helpless little body. Then another. And another. Kittens. 3 of them. Their eyes still sealed shut. Their bodies no bigger than the palm of his hand, wriggling against the warmth of her belly, their tiny mouths seeking milk. She was nursing them. She was caring for them. She was loving them. Her secret. Her desperate, exhausting, beautiful secret. She wasn't just a stray. She was a mother. The world tilted on its axis. Every late-night disappearance, every matted patch of fur, every sign of exhaustion, every frantic bolt for the door. It all snapped into a heartbreaking, breathtakingly beautiful focus. She wasn't sick. She wasn't dying. She was dividing her heart. She was keeping her vigil for a dying man inside, and then running out into the freezing cold to keep a vigil for her new life out here. Ben stood there in the freezing darkness, under a sky full of cold, uncaring stars, and he finally understood the weight of the feathers, the yarn, the petals. They weren't gifts. They were treasures. A mother, building a soft, beautiful world for her children, with the only things she had to give. He sank to his knees in the frost, the cold seeping through his pants, but he didn't feel it. He couldn't feel anything but the overwhelming, crushing, magnificent weight of what he was witnessing. This was her shift. This was her duty. And she had never, not for one single night, missed it. For a long time, Ben didn't move. He couldn't. He was anchored to the frozen ground, kneeling in the rust and the weeds, his breath catching in his throat. The world had shrunk to the small sacred space under that rusted ambulance chassis. The only sounds were the faint, hungry mewling of the kittens, the soft, rasping sound of Dusty's tongue grooming them, and the relentless, powerful hum of her purr. It was a lullaby sung in the dark, a promise. His mind, usually so clinical, so swift to analyze and diagnose, was utterly still. There was no diagnosis for this. This was something older than medicine. This was pure, instinctual love. This was a mother's work. He watched her, this creature he thought he knew. He saw the way she gently nuzzled each squirming baby, adjusting them closer to her warmth. He saw the utter exhaustion in the droop of her head, but he also saw a ferocity in her eyes he'd never witnessed before. This was her purpose. This was why she walked into a hospital every night, not for warmth, not for food, but to fulfill a debt of care she believed she owed to a dying man. She was splitting her soul in two, tending to both ends of the fragile thread of life, and it was wearing her to a shadow. The cold began to bite through the numbness of his shock, sharp teeth sinking into his knees and fingers. He had to move. He had to do something. But what? If he revealed himself, if he startled her, she might panic. She might abandon the nest. Or worse, she might move the kittens, trying to protect them from him, exposing them to the deadly cold in the process. His presence here was a violation. A necessary one, perhaps, but a violation all the same. He had to back away. Slowly, carefully, he shifted his weight, the frozen grass crunching like broken glass under him. Dusty's head snapped up instantly. The purring stopped dead. Her eyes, wide and reflective in the gloom, locked onto his. There was no recognition in them, only a primal, terrifying fear, a green feral fire. She bared her teeth, a silent, furious hiss escaping her throat. It was a sound he'd never heard from her, a sound that belonged to a cornered animal, a sound that tore a hole right through his heart. He froze, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. "Shh," he whispered, his voice a rough scrape, in the cold air. "Dusty, it's me, it's just me, I'm not gonna hurt you." She didn't blink, she didn't relax. Her body was tensed, a spring ready to uncoil, her every muscle screaming her readiness to fight, to die, for the 3 tiny lives behind her. She didn't see Ben, her quiet friend from the hallway. She saw a giant, a predator, a threat. He had never felt like more of a monster. He was terrifying the one creature who had offered him peace. Slowly, inch by agonizing inch, he began to retreat. He never broke eye contact, speaking to her in a low, steady murmur, a stream of nonsense and comfort. "It's okay. You're such a good girl, such a good mama. I see them. They're beautiful. I'm going now. I'm leaving. You're safe. You're so safe." He backed away until the shadow swallowed him, until he was sure she could no longer see him. He heard her anxious growl subside, but the purr did not return. The silence from under the ambulance was worse than the hissing. It was watchful. It was wounded. He turned and ran, not away from the hospital, but toward it. His mind was a whirlwind, a hurricane of fear and awe, and a desperate, clawing need to fix this, to fix it all. He burst through the emergency room. Doors, the warmth of the place feeling alien and suffocating. He must have looked wild-eyed because Maria looked up from her station, her face immediately etched with concern. "Ben? What's wrong? Is it a patient?" He leaned on her desk, trying to catch his breath, his hands trembling. "It's Dusty," he gasped. Maria's face softened with a gentle exasperation. "Oh, honey, did she not show up tonight? She does that. Sometimes. Don't take it personally." "No," he said, his voice firmer now, urgency giving it weight. "She did. Maria, she has kittens. 3 of them. Under the old ambulance in the back lot." The words hung in the air. Maria's professional calm evaporated. Her hand went to her mouth. "Oh my God. She's exhausted. She's starving. Herself. She's trying to be in 2 places at once, and it's killing her. The kittens. It's freezing out there. They won't last the night if it gets any colder." The words tumbled out of him, each one a sharp stone of panic. Maria was already moving, her nurse's instincts overriding the shock. Okay, think. We need a box, a blanket, something warm." She started yanking open cupboards. "We can't just grab them. She'll never trust us again. We have to bring them inside," Ben finished, the idea forming with a sudden crystal clarity. "We have to bring them all inside. To her. To Mr. Henley's room." Maria stopped dead, a stack of towels in her hands. She stared at him. "Ben, the regulations, infection control. We can't have a cat and her newborn kittens in a patient's room. It's impossible." "What's impossible?" Ben said, his voice low and intense. "Is letting that cat choose between the person she's been watching over and the babies she needs to keep alive. What's impossible is letting any of them die out there in the cold when we have a warm, safe building right here." He looked at her, and all his own grief, his own loneliness, his own need for redemption was laid bare in his eyes. "She's been giving him comfort for weeks. Now she needs us to give it to her. Please, Maria." Maria looked at him for a long, hard moment. She looked at the dedicated, broken-hearted doctor who had found a piece of his soul in a stray cat. She looked down the hall toward room 104, toward a dying man who had no one but the night staff and a feline guardian. She took a deep breath, and a slow, determined smile touched her lips. "Screw regulations," she whispered. "Let's go. Get our girl." 5 minutes later, they were a quiet, determined rescue party. Ben carried a small, sturdy cardboard box lined with a soft, warmed towel fresh from the dryer. Maria had a can of the strongest-smelling salmon pâté she could find in the staff fridge, and a pair of thick leather gloves, just in case. Their breath plumed in the frigid air as they approached the abandoned ambulance. "You stay back," Ben whispered to Maria. "Let me try first. She knows me. Or, she did." He approached slowly, the box under his arm. He could hear the faint, worried mewling of the kittens. Dusty was still on high alert. He saw the glint of her eyes in the darkness, watching him. No hiss this time. Just a deep, low growl of warning that vibrated through the cold air. He stopped, a good 10 feet away, and knelt down. He placed the open can of salmon on the ground. The rich, oily smell was immediate, cutting through the sense of frost and decay. He pushed it slightly toward her with his fingertips, then retreated. "Hey, Mama," he said softly. "Look what I brought. You must be so hungry. It's for you. All for you. Her nose twitched. The growling subsided. The primal need for calories, for the energy to feed her babies, was battling with her fear. He saw her lean forward, just an inch, her body still curled protectively around her kittens. She wanted it. She needed it. Ben's heart was hammering. This was it. The moment of trust. He stayed perfectly still, not even breathing. Slowly, so slowly it was almost imperceptible, she uncurled herself. She took one step out from under the ambulance, her eyes never leaving his. Then another. She stretched her neck toward the can, sniffed it once, twice, and then began to eat. It wasn't the grateful eating from before. It was a ravenous, desperate devouring. She was starving. While she was distracted, Ben moved. Not toward the kittens, toward her. He crept forward on his knees, his hand outstretched, not to touch her, but to let her know he was there. She flinched back for a second, a piece of salmon hanging from her mouth. But she didn't run. She didn't hiss. She just watched him, chewing, her body tense. "You're okay," he murmured, his voice a broken prayer. "You're doing so. Good. Just eat. It's okay." He was close enough now to feel the faint warmth radiating from her body, to see the individual mats in her fur, the weary sag of her belly. He could see the kittens clearly now. 3 little gray puffs, just like their mother, snuffling blindly in the nest she'd made of old leaves and dirt. When the can was licked clean, she looked up at him. The fear in her eyes was still there, but it was mingled with something else. A profound exhaustion. A silent plea. She was too tired to fight anymore. She had given everything she had. Ben, slowly, so slowly it felt like time itself had thickened, reached out his hand. He didn't go for her head or her back. He moved his fingers toward the box, sitting open on the ground beside him. He patted the soft, warm towel inside. "We're going to take you somewhere warm," he whispered. "You and your babies. Somewhere. Safe. You don't have to run anymore." He held his breath. This was the leap. This was the moment she would either bolt into the night or she would choose to trust him with her entire world. Dusty looked from his face to the box, to her mewling. Kittens under the ambulance. She took a step toward him. Then another. She hesitated, then ducked her head and gently, ever so gently, picked up the first kitten by the scruff of its neck. It went limp in her mouth, a natural instinct. She didn't put it in the box. She carried it over to Ben and, with an unimaginable tenderness, placed the tiny, squirming creature into his cupped hands. The feeling was electric. The trust was absolute, staggering, a physical weight in his palms. The kitten was impossibly small, warm, and alive, its heart beating a frantic rhythm against his skin. He felt his own breath hitch, his eyes burn with a pressure he hadn't felt in years. One by one, she brought them to him. She placed each of her babies into his waiting hands, her moss-green eyes watching his every move, ensuring he held them safely. She was transferring her world to him. She was making him a part of her pact. When all 3 were nestled together in the warm towel, a pile of sleeping, breathing hope, Dusty looked at the box, then back at Ben. She gave a soft, questioning meow. "It's okay," he said, his voice thick with tears he could no longer hold back. They streamed down his face, hot against his cold skin. "Get in, Mama. It's time to go home." He held the box steady. She placed her front paws on the edge, looked inside at her babies, and then, with a final graceful leap, she jumped in and curled her body around them. The purr started again, not ragged or thin, but deep, resonant, and full of a relief so profound it shook the very air. Ben carefully lifted the box, holding it close to his chest. He could feel the vibration of her purr through the cardboard, traveling up his arms and straight into his shattered heart. Maria approached, her own eyes shining with tears, and without a word, she draped the second warm towel over the top of the box, creating a warm, dark cave for the little family. They walked back into the hospital, not as a doctor and a nurse, with a box of contraband animals, but as guardians, as accomplices in a miracle. The automatic doors hissed open, swallowing them into the bright, warm light. They didn't stop at the nurse's station. They walked straight down the long, quiet hallway to room 104. Ben pushed the door open with his foot. The room was just as he'd left it, dim and quiet. Mr. Henley was asleep, his breathing a soft, shallow rhythm. Ben carried the box to the far corner of the room, away from the medical equipment, and set it down gently on the floor. He peeled back the towel from the top. Dusty peered out, her eyes scanning the familiar room. She saw the bed. She saw the sleeping man. She looked at Ben, and she gave one slow, deliberate blink. Then she carefully stepped out of the box, leaving her kittens sleeping soundly in their warm nest. She walked over to Mr. Henley's bed, stretched up on her hind legs, and placed her front paws on the mattress. She sniffed his still hand, and then, with a grace that belied everything she'd been through, she leaped up onto the chair that was always beside his bed. The chair his family never sat in anymore. She curled up on the chair, right where she could watch him and her babies. At the same time, she let out a huge, shuddering sigh, the sigh of a creature who had finally come home. Her purr erupted again, louder than Ben had ever heard it, a rolling wave of sound that filled the room, weaving together the fragile thread of a life ending and the three vibrant new threads just beginning. Ben stood there, his hands empty, his heart full. He watched the mother cat keep her watch over her entire world, finally united, finally at peace. He finally understood. It was never about a cat visiting a hospital. It was about a family finding each other. And he was a part of it now. She had chosen him. She had let him in. And in doing so, she had handed him back a piece of his own soul he thought was lost forever. The storm was over. The quiet had come. And in the warmth of that quiet, everything was finally perfectly clear. The next morning, the world felt different. It was a subtle shift, like the first day after a long fever breaks, when the light seems clearer and the air tastes sweeter. Ben hadn't slept much. He'd spent the rest of his shift drifting in and out of room 104, each time expecting to be met with a scene of chaos, with alarms sounding and administrators scowling. Instead, each time he pushed the door open, the same profound peace washed over him. Dusty was exactly where he'd left her, a soft, gray sphinx on the chair, her purr a constant, low-frequency engine of contentment. The kittens, full and warm, were a tangled pile of sleep in their box. And Mr. Henley. Mr. Henley was sleeping more deeply than Ben had ever seen. His breathing, while still shallow, had lost its ragged edge. The lines of pain that had been etched around his mouth for weeks seemed to have softened. It was as if the collective warmth of the small, furry family in the corner was radiating across the room, easing his passage. Word spread through the nightstaff not as a breach of protocol, but as a secret, shared benediction. Nurses would pop their heads in, not to check vitals, but to just look, to feel it, to see it for themselves. Maria became the unofficial gatekeeper, her face glowing with a quiet pride. They brought offerings, a small, shallow dish of water for Dusty, a softer blanket for the box. No one questioned it. It was, in that strange, suspended reality of the night shift, the most logical thing in the world. When the day shift arrived, there was a moment of tense uncertainty. The day charge nurse, a brisk, efficient woman named Carol, stopped short in the doorway of 104, her clipboard held to her chest like a shield. Her eyes scanned the room, the sleeping patient, the cat on the chair, the box of kittens in the corner. Ben held his breath, ready to defend their actions, to plead their case. Carol stood there for a long minute. Her stern expression flickered, then melted entirely. A slow, amazed smile spread across her face. "Well, I'll be," she whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. She walked over to the box and peered in at the sleeping kittens. She looked at Dusty, who lifted her head and gave a slow, regal blink. Carol blinked back. She turned to Ben, her eyes shining. "His daughter is on her way," she called ahead. "She's been driving all night." She nodded, more to herself, a decision made. Let's let them be until she gets here. The world, it seemed, had decided to be kind. Ben finally clocked out as the sun was coming up, painting the sky in streaks of pale orange and violet. He walked out of the hospital into the crisp morning air, and for the first time in 6 months, He didn't feel the need to squint against the light. He felt the warmth of it on his face. He drove home, and his empty apartment didn't feel empty. It felt quiet. It felt like a place where healing could begin. He slept a deep, dreamless sleep. And when he woke up in the afternoon, his first thought wasn't of loss. It was of a small gray cat and her 3 tiny breathing gifts. He returned to the hospital that evening, not with dread, but with a quiet anticipation. He went straight to room 104. The scene inside was different, but no less peaceful. Mr. Henley was propped up a little higher on his pillows. Sitting in the chair that Dusty had claimed was a woman in her 40s, with tired, kind eyes. She was holding one of her father's hands in both of hers, and curled in her lap, purring so loudly Ben could hear it from the door, was Dusty. The box was gone. In its place was a plush pet bed someone had brought from home, and in it, the 3 kittens were nursing, their little tails twitching. The woman looked up and saw Ben standing in the doorway. She didn't look surprised or angry. She looked grateful. She gently shifted Dusty aside, stood, and walked over to him, her hand extended. "You must be Dr. Evans," she said, her voice soft. "I'm Sarah Henley. I think I owe you a thank you." Ben shook her head. "No, not me. It was all her." He nodded toward Dusty, who was now weaving herself around Mr. Henley's ankles, her tail held high. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "The nurses told me about her sitting with him every night, and about the babies." She wiped at her eyes with a tissue. "I haven't been able to be here as much as I wanted. The drive, the kids. I felt so guilty, so alone in it." She looked back at her father, then at the cat. But he wasn't alone, was he? She was with him. And now I know he's been loved. Right to the end. She reached out and touched Ben's arm. "Thank you for letting them stay. Thank you for seeing what she needed." In that moment, Ben understood the final, beautiful symmetry of it all. Dusty hadn't just been comforting a dying man. She had been comforting a family. She had been a bridge. She had given a daughter peace, absolving her guilt, showing her that her father had not been abandoned. Love had been here all along, in the most unexpected form. Mr. Henley passed away 2 nights later. It was as peaceful an end as anyone could have wished for. He slipped away in his sleep, with his daughter holding one hand, and a soft purring cat curled up on the blanket beside the other. There were no frantic alarms, no last-ditch heroics, just a quiet letting go, surrounded by love in all its forms. The story of the hospital cat and her kittens became legend. It was written up in the local paper. The hospital administration, swayed by the outpouring of positive sentiment from staff, and the community, made a rare exception to policy. Dusty and her kittens were granted official residency in the long-term care wing, named the Henley family, in honor of the man who brought them all together. They became therapy animals. Before they'd even opened their eyes, their very presence a balm to patients and staff alike. Ben's life softened. The nights felt lighter. He started taking day shifts again. He started noticing the sunlight. He'd visit the long-term care wing on his breaks, and the kittens, now with their eyes open. 2 with their mother's mossy green, 1 with a startling ocean blue, would tumble over his shoes, chasing a feather toy or a piece of crinkled paper. He'd sit on the floor and let them climb into his lap, their tiny needle claws pricking through his scrubs, and he'd laugh. The sound felt unfamiliar in his throat at first, like a muscle he hadn't used in years. And Dusty? She was always nearby. She never followed him or demanded his attention, but she'd often hop up onto an empty chair beside him and slow blink, her purr a constant, steady hum. Her work was done. Her vigil was over. She could just be a cat now, a mother, a friend. One afternoon, a few weeks later, Ben was sitting in the hospital's small courtyard, enjoying a few minutes of sunshine. The kittens, now little balls of chaotic energy, were exploring the safe, enclosed space under their mother's watchful eye. Dusty was sitting on a bench beside Ben, her face turned to the sun, soaking in the warmth. One of the kittens, the boldest of the 3, the one with the blue eyes, stumbled over to Ben's foot. It looked up at him, let out a tiny, squeaky meow, and then, with immense effort, scaled the mountain of his leg, and settled into a small, warm circle on his lap. It began to purr, a tiny, rattling motor, a perfect miniature of its mother's. Ben looked down at the sleeping kitten, feeling the profound weight of its trust, the simplicity of its comfort. He placed a hand gently on its small, warm back, feeling the rapid, delicate beat of its heart. Dusty stood up on the bench, stretched, and then stepped daintily into his lap as well. She circled once, twice, and then curled herself around her, baby, enveloping both the kitten and Ben's hand in her warm, purring embrace. He sat there in the dappled sunlight, a man being used as a pillow by a cat and her kitten, and he felt it. The final gift. It wasn't a thing. It was a feeling. It was the quiet understanding that love isn't a finite resource. It doesn't get used up. It expands. It multiplies. It finds its way through the smallest cracks, under the doors we think we've sealed shut, and it fills the empty spaces. It shows up in the dead of night, in the form of a scruffy, tired, magnificent creature, and it asks for nothing but to be trusted. The love we give to one broken, lonely thing never leaves us emptier. It makes us a sanctuary. It makes us whole. You stayed till the end. Thank you. If it felt like a soft hug or a warm purr in your heart, subscribing lets me bring you more moments like this.